2024, an election year like no other. From the candidates to the issues, from voter integrity and analysis, we'll discuss debates, trends, patterns, election laws, and more. This is Vote 2024, Path to the Polls.
Presidential elections still about 6 months away, and you have to take any polling with a grain of salt. That said, polls give us an idea of what the electorate's thinking. Latest poll from the Public Opinion Research Lab at the University of North Florida provides some interesting insight into the psyche of voters, into questions such as, would a criminal conviction against Donald Trump change voters' minds? Or would they continue to support the former president? The biggest issue on voters' minds, of course, is the economy. As James Carville said, lo, those many years ago, when it came to what would be the decider, when it came to who would occupy the White House for the next 4 years, it's the economy, stupid. He may have said it in 1992, but it's very relevant 32 years later. Other big issues include immigration and border control. Surprisingly, abortion was third on the list, but that was before the law changed and the 6-week abortion ban went into effect. Joining me on Path to the Polls, Dr. Michael Binder, the director of the Public Opinion Research Lab at the University of North Florida. Thanks for being with us again.
Thanks for having me.
So polls indicate trends. You've been watching trends for some time, and given the latest polling, have you noticed any significant shifts or twists and turns given the events in the world? Any surprises?
Well, if you're thinking about surprises, it's hard not to look at how things have changed since 2020 as far as Biden support versus Trump support. By any neutral measure, Donald Trump hasn't had a great 3.5 years post-presidency. Indictments, criminal trials, a litany of different things. And Biden has really taken an economy that was in shambles and brought it back. The Dow is the highest it's ever been. And yet, Trump is ahead in a lot of swing state polls and has closed the gap nationally. And that, I think, if you just kind of look at those circumstances, I think that would be considered a surprise for kind of an observer that maybe came from a different time and poked down and saw what was happening today.
But the way people look at the economy and the way President Biden looks at the economy are two very different things.
Certainly. The impact of inflation post-COVID and the giant influxes of money into the economy, that has impacted folks continually, right? Just because the rate of inflation might decline, things are still more expensive than they used to be a couple of years ago. And greater rates of that change maybe than the previous 15 years before that. So folks' minds aren't geared toward what was happening in the late 70s when inflation was in double digits. We were used to single, 1, 2, 3% inflation, and it's been much worse than that lately.
Yeah, it is. So let's talk about the presidential contest. One of the interesting questions concerned Donald Trump's legal woes and whether a criminal conviction would change voter minds. According to the poll and the numbers that you saw, would it?
The short answer is no. Now, obviously, if you're an opponent of Donald Trump and a supporter of Joe Biden, that's not going to matter to you at all because you're already on the other side. The real question is, what happens to those folks that are maybe Trump supporters or Trump leaners? Would a conviction move them? And 8 or 9% said that it would, and that's interesting. It would make them less likely to support the president. Now, ultimately, do they show up and vote, or maybe for Biden, or do they maybe not vote at all? But if you were to lose 7, 8%, 9% of your base of support in what was going to be a close election, that could be exceptionally meaningful.
And you and I were chatting. There is not going to be a great it's not expected there's going to be a great turnout at the polls this go round.
No, you can expect turnout to be down from 2020. 2020 was an exceptional circumstance. Coming through COVID, the stakes of the election were painted in great measure, and it was going to be an exceptionally close race coming off of 2016, and it was. Turnout will be down. It won't be non-existent, but it'll be down from previous elections.
And we'll get into some of the reasons for that coming up here. So if history is any indication, 2024 may again be a tight race. 9% of the respondents to the poll we've been talking about, who are Trump supporters, said they would be less likely to vote for him if he was convicted. That could be a game changer, which is what you alluded to.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about it this way. We all think that it's going to be a handful of tight battleground states, maybe in the Rust Belt, kind of your Pennsylvanias, Michigans, Wisconsins. Maybe you want to bring in your Nevadas and Arizonas and Georgias and Virginia or North Carolina, something like that, depending. Think about if you take out 10% of the ballots cast for one of those candidates. Suddenly it becomes a blowout in those states. So yeah, absolutely, a 9% swing would be enormous.
Yeah, but if Biden's going to win, it's those Rust states where he is going to gain the most, and maybe even in coastal North Carolina if you look at history.
Right, he needs to maintain Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. If he were to lose some of those states, not just losing those states is a problem, what that portends for some of the other states, like North Carolina, where you think you might be able to hold on there potentially, or maybe steal that state, or in Arizona or in Nevada, which is probably going to have, we talked about abortion a little bit, that's going to have abortion on the ballot in Nevada. So there's a lot of things at play, but no, those big three Rust Belt states are really important for Biden.
And Michigan, with its large Muslim population, what happens in the Middle East is going to be, a big arbiter there.
And you wouldn't think that, right? The Muslim vote is an exceptionally small percentage of the national vote in the United States, less than 0.5%, right? It's real tiny. But in Michigan, it's outsized, right? They have a disproportionate number of immigrants there and folks of Muslim faith, and that's meaningful. And suddenly, if you just take out 20, 30,000 votes, maybe they don't vote for Trump. I don't see that happening. But maybe they choose not to vote for Biden, vote third party, don't vote at all, leave that bubble blank. That could be meaningful, and losing Michigan could be catastrophic for the Biden administration.
And by the same token, Florida's not a swing state, but you've got the big Jewish vote down in South Florida, and there's not a great Jewish population in the United States either. But if there's a big turnout in South Florida, that could be significant.
Certainly, and not just states like Florida and New York that maybe aren't particularly battleground states on either side of the aisle. But what does it mean for maybe congressional races down ballot? There's some close congressional seats down in South Florida, and if the Jewish vote is really aligned and pushes, maybe that turns a couple of those races down there as well.
And then there's control of the House and Senate, too, which is also significant.
Gee, that's not meaningful at all, is it?
No, that's extremely meaningful. And what the House and Senate do. The House and Senate have basically done a lot of nothing recently, but that's a whole nother show.
They've had some really good back and forths on the House floor, real important debates, real policy-oriented, no?
You're talking about OC and the little fight that she got into, and Green, yeah, again, that's an entirely different. There are so many shows that we could do. I won't even go there. Also, didn't seem to be a lot of enthusiasm for either of the candidates. According to your polling, they're not fans of Biden. They're not fans of Trump, according to the poll. That's no surprise. They haven't been fans of either of the candidates for the past couple of 3 years.
Yeah, that's true, and we see that with some of the enthusiasm for the election. A third of the electorate is not at all enthused about this upcoming election, and I think that's we're leading to talk about some of the turnout issues that we might see. I think that's probably part of it too.
You would think that would be a signal to the parties, both Republican and Democrat, that they've got to find somebody that is going to entice the American public to get behind them?
I mean, the Republican Party had a relatively competent set of candidates this past cycle. Former governors, senators, all kinds of national experience, and they all fell by the wayside to Donald Trump because the voters in the Republican primary preferred Donald Trump. Now, what does that mean for the rest of the country? That's a different story, but the primary elected, they're on board with Trump, and that's what you get when you have the system we have set up like this.
And on the Democratic side, they were going to do nothing to get in the way of the incumbent, so.
Right. I mean, if you're a Democrat, the incumbent is your best chance to win, hands down, so why would you? And, they didn't.
And when we come back on Path to the Polls, the issues of most importance to voters, stay with us. Path to the Polls continues. All right, let's talk issues. The biggest issue borne out by the poll is the economy. 27% of those polled said it was their biggest concern. That's Democrats, Republicans, independents, men and women. Look at the home buying market. Look at prices at the grocery store. I was surprised that immigration was number 2 on the list and not abortion, especially since Florida's abortion law was going to be ground zero as this poll was being taken. That surprise you?
Well, a little bit. Again, it's a national poll, so this is voters across the country. But abortion was right there. I mean, it was a percentage point. It was, a distant third. It's kind of like the Kentucky Derby. A couple of noses separated everything. But amongst Democrats, abortion was a much more important issue. And that's the thing that I think Democrats are leaning on nationally in swing states, in states like Florida where there's a ballot measure to be voted on, maybe Nevada as well. Can that mobilize folks and get them to the polls? I mean, particularly in 2022, Democrats stayed away from the polls like it had COVID. It was really bad for them.
I think it'll bring people to the polls here in Florida, especially since there's so much at stake.
Yeah, and the presidential election is going to bring people to the polls too. No matter what you say about the candidates, there's going to be so much attention on this race. Maybe not the commercials that we're used to seeing in Florida when we were a swing state, but there's going to be a senatorial race that's going to get some advertising, and obviously the national networks are going to be focused entirely and have been entirely on Biden and Trump for the next 6 months.
Right. Yeah, you've got Rick Scott, who of course is running for re-election. So respondents were asked their opinions about abortion policy. When asked whether they think policies surrounding abortion access should be decided at the national or state level, 30% said entirely at the national level, 18% mostly at the national level, 17% said mostly at the state level, 21% said entirely at the state level. And that's interesting since there are a lot of Trump supporters here, and he advocates for it to be a state matter.
Yeah, and I think part of this is tied up in where you think you have your best chance to have your policy enacted. So if you're a state like Florida, maybe, and you're a Democrat and you were hoping for a more open access to choice, you look at Florida with a 6-week abortion ban, you're like, oh, let's not do that. Let's keep this at the national level. Maybe we can work something out. Conversely, if you're a Republican in a state like New Jersey or New York, and maybe you're hoping for more pro-life policies, you're like, well, my state's not going to help me, so maybe we can get this done nationally and the Supreme Court can make things work, or get Trump in again and control the Senate and the House, those sorts of things.
And frankly, I've got to say, I was a bit surprised because initially, when Florida went to the 15-week rule, DeSantis was behind that, and then all of a sudden, things changed.
Well, right. He decided to run in a Republican primary for president.
And run for president, right. And that changed the entire landscape because he was doing things that were politically expedient for him.
Correct. And that's real, right? The electorate in a Republican primary is exceptionally different than a general election electorate. You don't have to worry about independents. You don't have to even worry about moderates in your own party because, A, they might not even show up at these primaries, but B, if they do, they're far outnumbered by the base core of your party. So that's where you got to target, and these are some of the policies that happen on the backside of that.
It'll be interesting to see what happens with this Florida election and the 15-week ban. It needs 60% to pass.
It does. It needs 60%, and that's a high bar. And I say that not because there's not support. In previous polls, we've had support, up over 60% for a similar measure, but of all the red states that have had abortion ballot measures, and they're passing, right? But they're passing with 54, 56, 57%. They're not at that 60% number. That 60% number is significant. There's a reason that the legislature makes it so difficult for voters to pass policies that they prefer that are counter to their preferences.
It's also going to be interesting to see how long it takes for the Supreme Court to get this issue on their ballot, on their table again. Because it's coming. Roe v. Wade is going to be revisited by the Supreme Court at some point.
Sure. At some state will go too far, and yes, it'll be back.
Have some states already gone too far? It's not a rhetorical question. Respondents were also asked if they would support or oppose a national ban on abortion after 15 weeks, except in cases of rape, incest, or to save the life of the mother. 50% said they would support such a ban, either strongly or somewhat, while 40% oppose. 10% said they don't know or refuse to answer. There is a vote on the November ballot here, Amendment 4. It needs 60%, as we said, to pass and overturn the 6-week ban. Given the numbers in that the poll, what's that tell you about the thinking of Florida voters?
Well, I think, thinking about this issue nationally is important first, right? That's a big number, right? 50% supporting any abortion policy is meaningful. And when you look at some of the states that have gone, like a Texas or a Florida, that have gone to the 6-week ban, that is clearly outside of the mainstream of the electorate. Now, is it far enough that it pushes enough voters to cast a ballot in Florida to go back to kind of a Roe v. Wade era, where it's viability outside the womb? I don't know that, but if you get 57% of the Florida voters to say, yes, I want Amendment 4 to pass, I'm rooting for viability, it's still not going to change because you need 60. But you have a strong majority. Heck, I think we could all agree that Ron DeSantis won his election in a landslide in 2022. If Amendment 4 gets the exact same vote totals, it doesn't pass.
But the reality is, when Ron DeSantis won that election, his politics were different than they are today.
They were certainly a little bit different. That's absolutely true. But that 59.8% of the vote that DeSantis got doesn't get Amendment 4 across the finish line. And I think that's something that voters need to wrap their heads around. Like, 60% is a really high bar.
There were some other realities that were different, too. It wasn't illegal to travel to get an abortion. And
that's real.
There were only, if my thinking is right, there are only 1 or 2 states that you can travel to get an abortion that are within a reasonable distance of Florida.
You're outside the South.
Right.
You are,
was it Indiana and Illinois?
Yeah, Indiana. I mean, you can get to Virginia.
There might be a third.
But that's 800-900 miles away. That's a 10-hour ride.
Yeah, which is...
That's significant. And the one thing that this does is people with means are not going to be impacted as much by this. People without means are disproportionately impacted by this, right? There's folks that they can call their job and say, hey, I'm taking off for a couple days. I'm going to fly so-and-so. I'll be back on Tuesday. Sure, great. Well, if you're working in an hourly job, you're not getting money. Maybe you don't have the money to pay the rent. Maybe you don't have the...
It's not practical. It's not feasible.
Yeah, the $500 for a flight, the $500 for a hotel, plus the doctor procedure. You don't have a couple $1,000s laying around on top of everything else. It's really disproportionately punishing those without the means to kind of avoid these types of circumstances.
It'll be interesting to see where Florida goes. So we've already established at the beginning of this program that the state of the economy may be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, issues in deciding who wins the White House. But abortion will play a major role. And would a repeal of Roe v. Wade make a difference in the Biden-Trump matchup?
Right? I think it could, but I also think that of all of these issues that are out there, when it comes to abortion, most people, it's not their number one issue. There are absolutely people on both sides of the aisle where that is all that they vote on. A great many folks vote on the pocketbook stuff. They vote on how is my life today? Is it better than it was last year? Is it trending in the right direction? Or is it trending in the wrong direction? And those are issues that, irrespective of an abortion policy, are sometimes what drive those kind of swing voters, even though there's not that many of them. But in tight races, swing voters can be exceptionally meaningful.
So if I remember, if memory serves, you're already working on your next poll, which has to do with something that people are talking about here. It's a divisive issue in this city, the stadium of the future.
We're ready to go. We'll probably be in the field as we speak.
Right.
And that is, we think that the voters need to have an opportunity to weigh in on the economic framework agreement that was reached between the mayor's office and the Jaguars and get their voices heard a little bit. Yeah, granted, there's these community huddles that are drawing 100 or 200 people throughout the city. There's 5 of them. But this is an opportunity kind of for folks that aren't willing to sacrifice a night and maybe miss a kid's soccer game to go sit through one of these. This is their chance to have their voices heard.
So just in laying the foundation, do you think people have a working and basic understanding of what it's really all about? Because, basically they sit back and they say, oh, Shad Khan has the money and he should be paying for it, and we don't know what the community benefit is. We don't know what the Jaguars have done for this community. They've just got a rudimentary understanding. I
mean, those are real legitimate concerns, right? If you talk to somebody who is a constitutional conservative who believes in fiscal responsibility, the idea of tax dollars going to fund a private person's personal business, that's not a great thing for them. So yeah, that might be all that you need to know. And while yes, the city's pointing to all of the other stadiums that have gotten public dollars, many of them came with state dollars that this isn't coming with. This is all on the backs of the locals. But it's also true that there are stadiums that have been built in the last decade and a half that didn't get any public dollars, aside from the land handout or the tax break or something like that. So, I am a season ticket holder up for the New York Giants. Right? We have a relatively new stadium. No tax dollars there. That was built on the back of both the tenants of the stadium, the Giants and the Jets, as well as the season ticket holders with PSLs. So there are multiple different ways that you can fund these projects.
And there's another difference here in that Florida doesn't provide any incentives, and some other states do.
Right. That's significant, right? If you look at New York, they kicked in a big number because the governor is from the Buffalo area, and they kicked in what essentially we're kicking in for this.
And, not taking a stand in either direction, you can't deny the fact that the Jaguars have changed the landscape of Jacksonville when it comes to attracting business and some other things, though they haven't improved the schools here.
Well, I mean, that's always the big argument. Oh, this city would be nowhere without the Jaguars. You can look at downtown and say, how different is it than it was 30 years ago? But you can also look at other cities that have maybe lost teams. Is San Diego worse off for not having the Chargers? I don't know the answer to that question. I think most people that have been to San Diego think it's a pretty nice place and are happy to go back. How worse off is St. Louis? And they lost the Rams a while ago. These are, some of these questions and some of these arguments that are laid out on both sides are very difficult to measure and get some real quantitative information on it. But it is clear that the return on investment economically for public investment in sports stadiums is not there.
And there's still other questions about downtown. People say we're a city of renderings. We have so many projects that never come to fruition.
That's
for
correct.
A lot of other reasons. So
Sure.
No, you don't have a crystal ball, but we live in a volatile world. We have a changing and volatile situation in the Middle East. We have a volatile situation in Washington. We have a volatile economy. We have the Supreme Court's action on Roe v. Wade yet to be determined. Big swing in support when it comes to all of politics. So much may change.
Certainly.
Heading toward November.
Sure, a lot can change between now and November, right? A felony conviction, an acquittal, a hung jury in Trump's case could alter. We're going to have a couple of debates. I don't know that a month ago people thought that was going to happen, so there's going to be some debates. I think that's good for democracy. But what happens in those could be meaningful and impactful. If Trump falls all over himself in the debate, what does that mean? If Biden falls all over himself in that debate, what does that do? That can really change the narrative going forward.
I got to say, I want to watch those debates. There will be no audiences. It's interesting to note that both of the candidates agreed to those debates to happen earlier than they normally would, so they have time to recover if something does happen.
Both of them.
Both of them.
But it's also true that our election cycles are much earlier, too. Having a debate in mid-October is really not as impactful because many people have cast their ballots already. Between absentee voting and early voting, ballots start being cast in the end of September in some circumstances. So it makes sense to kind of move the timeline up for these debates so those early voters, thinking about military overseas ballots, they go out a couple of months ahead of time. So there's a lot of things to consider besides just being able to recover, which is absolutely part of it.
Right, and you're thinking about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Is he going to make any difference, do you think, in the election? Can he play the role of spoiler? I know that wasn't included in
it wasn't, and I think part of the issue with somebody like that is, do they have the resources to A, get on all the ballots, and B, make enough of a splash nationally to show up on some of these debates, and I don't think that's going to be the case. But a couple of percentage points in a really tight state can make a difference. Think back to Florida in 2000, right? I think Democrats would be kidding themselves if they didn't think that the presence of Ralph Nader impacted the outcome for Florida in that race.
Oh, yeah, talk to Al Gore. You know, it would be more of a negative impact for the Democrats than anybody else.
Probably, but neither party wants RFK on the ballot.
No.
Neither the Trump Republicans nor the Democrats.
And the Kennedy family doesn't want RFK Jr. in the ballot either.
Maybe the worms want him on the ballot.
I don't know. Hey, always a pleasure. Thanks for being here. Dr.
Thanks
Michael
for having
Bender.
me.
And if people want to check out that poll in its entirety, they can go to
our website.
There you go.
UNF Portal, Google machine will find you.
Thanks for being here. Another edition of Path to the Polls coming up the day after, I was going to say Labor Day, but that's wishful thinking of moving things forward past the hot summer.
Don't want to miss the whole summer.
It is going to be a hot debate season. And by the way, our next issue of Path to the Polls, it will be the day that they have closing arguments in the Trump criminal trial and the case goes to the jury. We'll be talking with a practiced trial attorney who has been both a prosecutor and a defense attorney. You won't want to miss this. And if you want to revisit this show, an encore presentation tonight at 7 o'clock or on demand at your leisure when you want to sit back and kind of dissect it yourself on News4Jax Plus, News4Jax YouTube channel, and News4Jax.com. Have a great day.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.